to have one of those horrible noises that come out of two microphones. But I'd like to first introduce our panelists today. Dr. Rebecca Auer, as we mentioned, was the co-chair of this conference for the first year, and we're very grateful to have you as part of the team. Rebecca is the Executive Vice President, Research and Innovation at the Ottawa Hospital, CEO and Scientific Director of the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute. With us is Dr. Stuart Edmonds, who's the Executive Vice President of Mission, Research and Advocacy at the Canadian Cancer Society. Welcome, Stuart. Thank you for being here. And behind the tree over there is Joanna. I'm going to ask you to just pull your chair out just a touch. Thank you so much. Is Dr. Joanna Gotfrit, who is a medical oncologist at the Ottawa Hospital Cancer Center at the University of Ottawa as well. Thank you all for being here. So the format of this panel is that each is going to speak for approximately 5 to 7 minutes or so, presenting a different perspective on the clinical trial environment. And then it's a very open forum session for questions, so that please do come up to one of the two microphones that are here, and the hope is that we get a good dialogue. So I'm going to ask Rebecca to begin with her comments. Rebecca, you are well written about on some of the challenges and changes needed in the Canadian clinical trial environment, and so I know that you wanted to share some of those thoughts with us.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to be here and to speak. Just by way of introduction, I am newly the EVP of the Ottawa Hospital for Research and Innovation, but my background is as a cancer surgeon, and I've looked after cancer patients for over 2 decades now, and I'm also a cancer researcher, so I have a translational research lab that does wet lab research as well as clinical trials. And lastly, I am the wife of a patient who has stage 4 cholangiocarcinoma, which is a rare cancer in the liver, and bile ducts of the liver. I don't use the word caregiver because he still probably does a better job looking after me than I do of looking after him. I think that's part of my drive and my passion for some of the things I've been thinking about a lot. My interaction with the healthcare system as a researcher and as a physician was really quite different than my interaction with the healthcare system as a patient advocate for my husband. And obviously incredibly passionate about the importance of clinical trials, particularly in cancer in today's day and age. And so some of my frustration comes from that personal experience. I really think that when we think about clinical trials and we're thinking about the pandemic and vaccines, we're thinking about a clinical trial of a therapy that would be something we would want to test and understand and evaluate across all people, or different types of patients. But cancer increasingly is becoming a set of ultra-rare diseases. And the more that we understand cancer, the more that we understand that these are ultra-rare diseases. And so if you just consider a couple of things, it took 13 years to sequence the first human genome. That happened in about 2 decades ago in 2003. It cost $2.7 billion, and it was an international effort. Now we can sequence the human genome in about 24 hours, and it costs about $1,000. And we can do that for any cancer. Not necessarily affordably in Canada for every single patient, but that is possible now today. Things like cell-based immunotherapies, which have completely transformed the cancer landscape. So there are, like the first cell therapy was approved in 2010, so it's only 14 years ago. There are 26 cell therapies that are approved now, but 7 of them were approved in 2023. So 7 of those 26 in the last year. And monoclonal antibodies, which we all know are hugely important in cancer therapies. All of our MABs, pembrolizumab, ipilimumab, bevacizumab, those are all monoclonal antibodies. They were first discovered, or first FDA approved and used in 1987. So that does seem like a long time, but for the next 25 years, about 2 monoclonal antibodies were approved per year. But last year, we approved 23, or the FDA did. These are kind of FDA numbers. And in the last 10 years, about 17 to 20 a year. This is the pace of discovery that we now face. And we have spent an incredible amount of time and energy, nationally and internationally, to understand the precise molecular mechanisms that underpin our cancers. And it's not just a genome. Now we have the proteome, we have the surface proteome, we have the epigenome, we have the interactome. These are all things that are going to come into play as we start to understand our cancers better. This is what we wanted to get to. And then look at our clinical trials. So the first placebo-controlled randomized clinical trial was undertaken in 1947. And that's still what we consider the gold standard. That was about 6 decades plus before we sequenced the first human genome. To think that what we understood about how to evaluate therapies, 6 decades before we understood how to molecularly sequence a cancer, it doesn't make sense. I think we really need to think differently if we want to start to understand how to integrate cancer therapies, how to combine them, which ones to use together. We're not going to be able to use this traditional paradigm of evaluation. This is simply a math problem. So I recently had to relearn factorials with my youngest son. But if you think about it, if you have 3 different therapies and you want to figure out if you should use them together or separately and what combination, so you could use each one separately, that's 3. Or you could combine them in different ways, so that's 3 factorial, which is 3 times 2 times 1, which is 6, so 6 plus 3, that's 9, that's easy. Add a couple of different doses, now add 5 different molecular mutations in that tumor with 5 different therapies. There are now FDA approved over 100 molecularly targeted therapies for cancer. So 7 factorial, that's like, I don't even know. It's in the thousands, right? You can't possibly think that we could do clinical trials for all of these possible permutations and combinations in the system that we have today, or any system. So I really think we actually have to fundamentally think differently. We have these incredible principles for implementation of research ethics that came out of, in the 1940s to 70s, the Belmont Report, the Nuremberg Report, and these are incredibly important. We have to ensure that we have respect for person, beneficence, justice, and that is the framework that has, created our good clinical practices in this country. And those principles absolutely have to be adhered to. I think they are paramount. But I think our interpretation of them has led us to a place where we're no longer living those values. And I would say in particular, justice is one. Where it is so challenging to access a clinical research study, depending on where you live, how much money you have, who you see as a physician, what center you're at. And so actually some of what we have put in place to protect patients is actually the biggest barrier for our most vulnerable patients. So I would argue that we need to think completely differently. I think we should acknowledge that research is care. We cannot have research patients and then regular patients. And that language is used almost at every hospital that I worked at, right? Well, that patient can't go there, can't have that bed because that's a research patient. No, that's a hospital patient who happens to be getting the best care available on a research protocol. A nurse can't draw that blood because that's not a research nurse. Drawing blood is drawing blood. You can't use that scale because it's not a research scale. A scale is a scale. If it's good enough for regular care, it must be good enough for research. And if it's not, make it better for regular care. So I think that we need to really have this concept that we integrate care into our research, into our care paradigm. If we do that, if we start to acknowledge that, some of the barriers around decentralization, for example, go away. Because we understand that if you are a cancer center in Canada, you are going to adhere to a certain set of standards. And those standards are good enough for every patient, including every patient on a research study. And ideally, every patient should be on a research study. We should learn from every interaction. We should understand well beyond Health Canada approval how these drugs are working, how they work together, who they don't work for, and why. We could get there as a learning healthcare system, but I don't think we're going to get there with the incremental changes that we're talking about. It is a fundamental culture shift. It is a radically different way of thinking. It is acknowledging that patients have a right to participate in research, and we have an absolute responsibility to provide them that opportunity.
Thank you, Rebecca, and I do want to encourage all of you to have your questions ready. We're going to move on through each of the panel members and then come back. Stuart.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. I think I'm here wearing a number of different hats. Firstly, with the Canadian Cancer Society, we're one of the largest funders of cancer research, and so building on Rebecca's point, we're adding to that complexity by funding research that's trying to add new evidence, new knowledge to cancer. And that means that we need to, it's adding that complexity, meaning that we need to find better ways to conduct clinical trials. We need to have a vibrant, efficient clinical trial system in this country that actually allows us to have a destination for new innovations that we develop, so that these new innovations can benefit Canadians as fast as possible. Barry kind of alluded to this earlier, that we see that a number of innovations that are really made in Canada are being tested elsewhere just because of the efficiency and the speed that clinical trials can be set up in other jurisdictions, and so Canadians are benefiting from those made in Canada innovations. I was also very fortunate to be part of a team developing a report in 2011 that was focused on the state of cancer clinical trials in Canada. And at the time, we were driven to develop that report because of just challenges that we saw in Canada in terms of efficiency in launching clinical trials initiation, the complexity, the anticipated increased complexity of conducting clinical trials. We developed a number of recommendations, one of which was the establishment of an infrastructure, a coordinating centre, and that led to the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer funding 3CTN. We're very proud of what 3CTN has achieved over the years in terms of increased accrual of patients, developing tools and common contracting processes across the country, but also innovating. We heard about craft and decentralizing clinical trials as well. So 3CTN is an amazing asset that we have in the Canadian cancer research community. And the concern, as we heard from the previous speaker about all the new projects that have been established, is what about sustainability? I think it was Monique Bejean said when she was Minister of Health, there were a country of pilot projects. And how do we get away from that idea of just setting up all these pilot projects, but actually not having any long-term funding plan for these projects? We have to think about more strategically about how we set these things up, like 3CTN, and keep them funding in perpetuity. If they're actually doing good things, let's keep them going. And so early this year, we started to look back at the report that we developed in 2011 and considered what else we need to do. We were fortunate that Rebecca wrote an excellent op-ed, and Janet Dancy also had an op-ed that we could also lean on, and it gave us a good sense about what we need to establish to do better in clinical trials. So at the Canadian Cancer Society, we started a process by which we wanted to engage all stakeholders in the clinical trial environment to not re-diagnose all the issues with clinical trials, but to really develop solutions. We understood that actually, as I mentioned earlier, that we need every stakeholder to put their shoulders to the wheel to start fixing some of the big problems we have with clinical trials in this country. So we've embarked on a process of consultations across the research community, across the provincial cancer agencies, funding agencies, patients, and institutions, as well as government representatives, to really understand how do we solve all the problems we have with clinical trials. We had the first workshop earlier this year that was it was an expert workshop. Lots of clinical trialists, but also CHR was there, Health Canada was there, as well as other stakeholders involved in actually clinical trials on the ground level. And that really kind of set the stage for further consultations that we're holding in the next few months with patients, as I said, with capital members and with funders. So we're looking at developing solutions that we can all then take to influence who we need to influence, whether that's the federal government, provincial government, or with our institutions, to actually have a change that can actually can change the clinical trial system in the country. The last thing that I just wanted to touch on is really about patient advocacy. I think there was a report recently on CBC that actually may have been concerning to many people. So I think there's really a case right now that we need to restore confidence in the clinical trials enterprise in the country. And I'd like us to see us having more awareness campaigns about clinical trials. Right now, it's so difficult for a patient to be empowered to ask about clinical trials. Using clinicaltrials.gov, for example, is not a patient interface. It's not patient-friendly in any way. So how do patients find out about clinical trials? So we need to do a better job of really empowering patients, providing patients with information, to be able to go to the healthcare provider and talk about clinical trials, bring that subject up to the healthcare provider. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. And just if you could, before we move on to Joanna, just reinforce the roundtable initiative that's happening with the Cancer Society, that would be useful, I think, to the audience.
So I kind of alluded to that. The
Yeah.
process we're in, we're midway through the consultation process of engaging the various stakeholders. We spoke to capital members, and we're re-engaging capital members in the coming weeks. We have a patient forum that's Stephen was very fortunate to allow us to speak to some of the patients that he's bringing together for the 3CTN conference. So the idea is to really develop a position paper that will help many stakeholders start to influence, but also to provide clear direction of what we need to do in cancer clinical trials together as an ecosystem.
Yeah, thank you for reinforcing that, because I think we want to focus some of the conversation as we move through this panel on solutions, and that sounds like a really amazing place to generate some of those. Welcome, Joanna. Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much, Anne-Marie, and thank you for the opportunity to discuss my perspective as a clinician who every day is trying to get patients onto clinical trials in my medical oncology clinics. And first and foremost, I just want to say that when I have a patient in front of me and I'm considering if I should put them on a clinical trial, what's going through my mind is basically, how can I get the best treatment for this patient? How can I get a better treatment than what's available in a standard fashion? I'm not really thinking this patient's going to help us get to the answer of the clinical trial quicker, or this is going to help get the drug to market faster. I'm really asking myself, how do I get a better treatment for this person sitting here in front of me? And despite the fact that I think lots of us do think that way, only about 3% of patients in Canada actually access a clinical trial, which is a very, very small proportion, given that clinical trials are our access mechanism to unfunded, unapproved, and novel therapies that are usually, or at least have a very good chance of being better than the standard of care. And I think the reasons for the difficulty are very multifactorial, and I see them kind of trickle down into my day-to-day practice very frequently. It's been alluded to already, but the geographic disadvantage for patients who live further away is very, very real. We talk about treatment toxicity, we talk about financial toxicity, but we don't talk a lot about time toxicity. And patients who have cancer, especially a terminal metastatic cancer, time is their most valuable asset. And the way cancer centers are usually arranged, this is the way the Ottawa Cancer Centre, where I work, is arranged, like many, is a centralized center where we do most of our clinical work. However, we have satellite centers, we have 5 or 6 around our area. We serve an area 2 hours away in any direction, and our patients can access their treatment, their CT scans, their blood tests, etc., at their local satellite sites, and only need to travel a few hours in on occasion when there's something specific that they need at our central center. And we also use virtual care quite frequently in those circumstances as well. Yet for clinical trials, that paradigm does not exist at all. All clinical trials must occur at the Central Cancer Center. And just a week or 2 ago, I had a patient who was very excited about a clinical trial, curative intent, head and neck cancer, told him all about the details, was very excited about it. And then when I told him he's going to need to travel in for everything, all his tests, all his physician visits, all his blood tests, the treatments, and he couldn't access his much closer satellite site, he said, absolutely not. I'm not coming that far, that frequently, and actually declined the trial. And we can say, patients have a choice, but really what choice do they have? The good thing is, it doesn't have to be this way. We have examples of using decentralized hospital-level access in regular standard clinical practice. We've heard about the CRAFT framework with 3CTN, looking at how we can decentralize clinical trials. And I want to highlight, we also in Ottawa are running clinical trials in a decentralized way, also using virtual care in some circumstances. So just to point to virtual care, as we all know, the pandemic pushed us 20 years into the future overnight. Virtual care became commonplace. It has absolutely revolutionized medicine. I would say it's revolutionized my clinical practice, and we use it in a very safe and effective way every day. And within Ottawa, we have this trial paradigm called REACT clinical trials, which are essentially investigator-initiated, usually physician-initiated, clinical trials that compare two different standard of care arms, so not the usual classical trial, but 2 standard of care arms. And the paradigm for that trial is set up such that patients can receive their treatments close to home, they can do their CT scans close to home, they can do their blood tests close to home, they can do some virtual care, and we still are able to very well assess the trial efficacy, determine the answer to the question that was posed, publish the results. So it can be done, we just need to be motivated to do it, and this will hugely increase access to the disadvantaged patients that just by pure luck happen to live further away. The second point I want to make is around safety and inclusion-exclusion criteria of clinical trials. So as we've heard already, of course, safety is paramount in trials. It's very important, and many of the regulations, including the inclusion-exclusion criteria, are devised around safety. But I would say in my day-to-day clinical practice, trying to get patients onto trials, the criteria are often my biggest impediment to actually getting otherwise perfectly eligible patients into studies, often due to fairly arbitrary, or I'd say often non-clinically relevant criteria. So things like brain metastases. Brain metastases will often exclude patients from a trial, but brain metastases are something that real-world patients have, and when those drugs are ultimately approved, patients with brain metastases are going to get those drugs. So we should not be denying patients with brain metastases access to clinical trials just based on that point. Same thing goes for sometimes arbitrary lab cutoffs, sometimes minor comorbidities where in the clinician's judgment, the trial could be very perfectly safe, and they might even get those drugs in a standard fashion in a later line of therapy or in a different tumor site. Yet unfortunately, there seems to be very little physician discretion in the design of the trials, the design of those criteria, and also the assessment of the patient in front of them when considering if a trial is best for a patient. So I would really encourage us to consider if we've gone so far to the side of safety that we're actually, as Rebecca mentioned, shooting ourselves in the foot and denying patients the best options available to them. And I want to highlight a very interesting paper from several years ago that looked at the increase in safety regulation steps for clinical trial regulation over the last decades, including the additional cost for those additional safety regulation steps. And what they found was basically that for every life year saved from a safety perspective on clinical trials, the cost from extra regulation is about $2.7 million. So we've swung the pendulum so far to the side of safety that we're increasingly having exorbitant costs for it, and we're denying patients access. And so I think we need a good hard look on the safety versus access versus financial piece of the whole system. And then the third point that I just want to touch on briefly is around finding clinical trials. So at my center in Ottawa, of course, I know which clinical trials are available. We review them as a group, and we always have a handful of trials available for each tumor site. But many of our patients aren't eligible for those trials, or they're not the best trials for them. But they very well could access a trial in another city, or sometimes in another country. And even just the process of trying to identify where are trials that patients would be eligible for, that meet the criteria that they're looking for their life, for their treatment, oral drugs versus IV drugs, toxicity profiles, where are they willing to travel, etc. The databases that we have available are so onerous, they're very difficult to really pinpoint a good trial for a patient. And it was mentioned before, we're using AI for all sorts of things. Why not use AI or better systems to really help us identify trials for patients locally and remotely for those who are, motivated and willing to travel? Thanks for your attention.
Thanks to all of you for being provocative too. We really do value that. So again, I encourage everyone to come up to the microphone as we move into a series of questions. I'll kick it off by suggesting that the issues around the environment, clinical trial environment, are in many ways well discussed, clearly articulated, and many of them long term. It would be helpful to move into a conversation of where we could maybe focus on a couple of short-term, immediate things that we could do, especially with the multi-stakeholder nature of this audience, to begin to circle in and hover down on some of the solutions that we can do next year, the year after, as opposed to oftentimes the 20-year solutions, which validly, as Rebecca, you laid out, are necessary, but how do we take that next step forward? So if each of you could just a couple of easy, I'll call them easier win solutions based on the strengths that we know are in the Canadian marketplace, that would be helpful. And please, I encourage all of you to come to the mics. So we'll go through that question, but thank you for stepping up. Rebecca.
Well, that's a bit of a hard one for me because I feel like we're sort of at that point where we're asking how we breed, faster horses when really what we need to do is invent a car. I really, we're playing a bit of whack-a-mole right now, and I'm not sure that's actually what we want to do. I think fundamentally we have to change how we see research and care integrated. So if our hospitals could embrace this vision that a patient that is being looked after on a clinical research protocol is a patient that belongs to that hospital. And Health Canada could see that we don't need to have separate temperature monitors for standard of care drugs that happen to be given to a patient who's on a clinical trial versus the patient in the bed beside them who's getting that same drug but not on a clinical trial. I mean, these are things that just need to change. They're not hard to change. We just have to decide that we want to change them. I think it has to happen at all levels. It has to happen at the hospital level. It has to happen at the government level. It has to happen at our workforce level. So, yeah, I guess we can make small incremental improvements. I think we have a great cancer clinical trial system in this country. The Canadian Cancer Clinical Trials Group has an incredible network. They have pre-existing contracts with each other. Have been generously funded through the Canadian Cancer Society for years. They're a machine that works. If we could empower them to work better by saying that, if some of these regulations could be slightly changed or differently interpreted, then I think that it would be a lot easier to open clinical trials across this country for patients to travel across provincial borders to get access, or ideally not even have to travel to get access. I don't know. I think empowering our what we already have might be the sort of most proximal solution, maybe.
I agree with Rebecca. I think, in my mind, there are no quick wins, and this is and we certainly embarked on this new process, understanding that there are no quick wins, because from what we tried to do in 2011, that although 3C10 is great work, there's a lot of heavy lifting there as well. So even in 2011, when we recognized that just with research ethics boards, we had a huge kind of system problem there, and that was causing delays in trial initiation. It's not an easy thing to just say, let's have a national ethics board. If it was that easy, we would have done it. And there have been some regional ethics boards that have been built up, but it's still, we don't have a single national ethics board. And maybe there's a way that we can somehow enforce that. I know the ACT Consortium is working on that, but maybe there is some way to. We've gone beyond incentivizing. We actually have, instead of having a carrot as a stick, and that funding organizations say actually we're going to fund clinical research that goes through a national ethics board. But I'm sure that PJ will talk about that doesn't solve all the problems. Some institutions still want to retain kind of control and ensure that their patients are safe. To Rebecca's point about having clinical trials being part of healthcare, it seems absurd that we're having this conversation. Really, it's the fact that if we want to have a learning healthcare system, so then the main research aspect that's going to have an impact on healthcare is through clinical trials. So then, we are actually treating patients through clinical trials. I think in Canada, unfortunately, because of our healthcare system, we can't afford to provide all the drugs necessary, or the best drugs for patients. And so oftentimes the only way patients can get access to new innovative therapies is through clinical trials. So we're actually providing life-saving treatments through clinical trials. So I absolutely agree that research is care, but I also think that care is research. That almost always we have a situation where when a patient is actually being treated, the data isn't collected. It isn't being used to inform treatments of other patients, and so understanding about the sequencing of treatments. We have some registry trials that are set up, but they're few and far between. So we really rely on industry to do phase 4 trials, but even beyond those phase 4 trials, we're not collecting data. So how do we have a research-focused healthcare system as well? I don't know. There's lots of issues and challenges, but I think we need to think about kind of where we want to get to and then how do we get to it.
Yes, thank you. And Joanna, I'm going to give you the final word on this, but as always, the solutions seem to be in place. The whats are there, it's the hows that consistently seem to be the blockage point. Thank you for being patient and coming to the microphone too.
Yeah, so if I had to make one point on this matter, I would say that we have a huge over-reliance on the overall survival endpoint that isn't as relevant now when we have such an array of molecularly targeted therapies where we know that if they work in one tumor type with that molecular target, they're very likely to work in multiple tumor types with that molecular target. And overall survival endpoint clinical trials are incredibly long, incredibly onerous, incredibly expensive to run. And now that we're starting to understand molecular targets better, I think we easily, in a medium-term fashion, could start to rely on other endpoints. Do we do a smaller trial and just look at objective response rate to see if it's similar to the trial's objective response rate that did prove an overall survival advantage in another tumor type? Can we use these surrogate endpoints to start to obtain approvals for drugs used in multiple different tumor types? It's absolutely not practical to do an overall survival trial for the same drug, for the same target in every single type of tumor. And where does this change need to be made? It needs to be made at the CADF level. Can we start to accept surrogate endpoints that are not overall survival or sometimes progression-free survival for drug approvals to get them to market? That could speed us up significantly where appropriate. And all we need to do is make that decision. The people at the top need to just decide that that is okay. So I would say that would be my quick to medium term win.
Hi. Summer.
Hi, is this on?
Yes.
Thank you all so much for your perspectives and your passion. I really enjoyed all of your comments. I'm curious, I'm from the US, so I'm curious about if anyone can speak to examples from the Canadian context of either like right to try initiatives like we have in the US where something is fast-tracked, or even clinical trial results where there's a limited market release to something before phase 3 clinical trial results are in, like in the Relivrio case with ALS. I'm just really curious if there's something that jumps to mind from the Canadian context in that vein. I'd be interested to hear that. Thank you.
I can take a stab at that. So I do know that within CADF we do have a paradigm for conditional access where approvals can be sought for drugs that are in earlier phase, such as phase 2 data that looks promising, and then there is a certain time period, don't quote me, but I believe there's a 3-year time period after that conditional approval where the phase 3 data must come to light and must also be positive in order to get the full approval. And that's a relatively new initiative to my knowledge. We did not have that several years ago. And so there are, we do see attempts being made to try to get that earlier data into the regulatory system to get approvals faster, conditionally upon the later phase data confirming results.
And I would just say through Health Canada, we have our special access, there's a special access program, but also an OLIP, so I can't remember what it stands for now, but essentially an N1 clinical trial program that you can apply for if you have the company on board, obviously, to provide the drug. It isn't a straightforward process, though, but it certainly is available. And then there usually is a compassionate access program while a drug that's been through Health Canada approved is going through that decision process around making funding decisions. So it would be great to have more access to these therapies, especially for rare cancers that have ultra-rare molecular mutations. My husband's cancer is 800 patients in Canada, and 45% of those cancers have a molecularly targetable mutation, of which there's a drug available today, either approved in a different cancer or available in a clinical trial. And currently, none of those drugs are funded, except for one, only in Alberta and Quebec.
Hi, Linda Hunter. I'm a patient partner. I'm also a retired nurse for 40 years, and I remember 35 years ago when clinical stuff was over here and research is over here. 40 years later, clinical stuff is here and research is over here, and there's still a great divide. So it boggles my mind. I have a few comments, and I also wish that chair at the end had a patient partner in it. I would really love to hear some reflections from that perspective. But excellent overviews. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more, Rebecca, you brought it up, clinical care and research has to be brought closer together. May I suggest the only way we're going to bring them closer together for the future is in training at the undergraduate level as people go through training in the basic sciences with the health professions, that they actually understand the intersections between those two, because really the circle intersection is the patient themselves, who benefits from clinical care and who benefits from research care. But I really find sometimes funding partners, perhaps researchers, I don't know, depending on who they are and how well they work in co-partnership, the need for trust in building relationship. You talked about time, you talked about time in relation to disease entities and clinical trials, but there's also time to build relationships to actually do it properly. And what is it that we're trying to do properly is bring people together to co-lead clinical trials. And I think we have to have that realization. And part of that realization is to use patients up front in blue sky thinking, strategic planning, developing research questions that are appropriate for them and their diseases. I mean, we're talking about oncology, but we also say we're disease agnostic. Oncology at a 3, maybe to 6% rate of people that are patients in clinical trials is probably 0.5 in a lot of other diseases that are not as well researched. So I think we can train patients and community partners, and I just want to put a little bit of a plug. While navigating clinical trials is very, very poorly done in Canada and many places from a patient's perspective, what is there right now is there, and what is there right now isn't even known by people that could potentially benefit for signing up for a clinical trial or even finding out more information. So we have produced a patient navigation of clinical trials with available stuff right now, but I'd like your comments on some of these things. I mean, I know you said, there's no immediate thing. I think there is some low-hanging fruit. I think we can work better in, networking, social media, using patient and disease organizations. I think we can insist that there's guest speakers in undergraduate programs talking about patient engagement, talking about clinical trials, talking about bringing people together. So I think if we all work together to do some of these things, I'm interested in hearing your comments and some of those suggestions. Thanks very much.
Stuart, do you mind, because we're going to chat about the issue of awareness?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. So when I said there were no easy wins, I think that's thinking of kind of from a system level. I think absolutely from a patient empowerment piece, I think there's a lot we can do, whether that's through awareness programs or so education programs, but involving patients more intimately in kind of design of research projects as well. We, at the Canadian Cancer Society, we actually published a paper a few years ago that actually talked about how the role of people with lived and living experience in research, setting priorities, is so important. We've now, our whole research program is informed by those people affected by cancer, and it helps us make decisions about where we invest in research, what projects we fund, and we've also gone a step further in insisting our researchers actually involve patients as partners in research and the research process themselves. So we think it's a really, really important thing to ensure that we're funding research that meets the needs of those affected by cancer. So absolutely, but I think going back to clinical trials, I think there's absolutely things we can do in terms of awareness pieces for patients, and just Joanna highlighted the issue of not having a good database for patients to be able to mine. We're actually working on developing a database for patients that's not like clinicaltrials.gov. It's going to be much more patient-facing, bilingual, and it's hopefully going to be a way to really, again, empower patients to understand what opportunities there are for them to be on clinical trials.
Just wanted to say both really excellent points, and I would agree with that. That, patient engagement. I mean, probably the key. When you asked, how do we do this? I mean, patients are constituents, right? And if they don't understand about clinical trials and they don't understand the opportunities, then they can't possibly advocate not only for themselves but for the system changes that are needed. So I think that's a really important point. And to your point about education, I'm thinking a lot about this in my new role, and I actually think we need to be a lot even bolder than that. I think you should not be able to graduate from medical school without research training. You should not be able to graduate from medical school without a certificate in TCPS2, which you can today in Canada. That is mind-blowing. That you would be able to graduate from a Canadian medical school and not have done the Tri-Council policy on the ethical conduct of research in Canada. How is that even possible? How has that not been fixed? But that's just a start. Really, if every physician graduated from medical school understanding that research is part of their job and it's part of the best care that they provide to their patients, that matters, right? And physicians are, at the end of the day, most are just like Joanna. They just want to get the best care for their patients. They have resource limitations, they have time limitations, they have pressures on them, but at the end of the day, that's what they want. And if they understood that research was part of that, I have no doubt they would incorporate that in their practice.
Thank you. I do want to suggest that we've got 3 complementation advocates speaking at this conference as well, who I know are going to reinforce many of the points are here. To me, the issue of awareness is one thing, but navigation is another. It's one thing to make people aware, but then somebody needs to help them understand a system that is perhaps not always working in their favor. Joanna, did you have any other comments?
Yeah, actually, that was a perfect segue because I did pick up on the patient advocate here asking about navigation. And navigation is a huge, I would say, resource constraint that we have across healthcare. At my own cancer center where Rebecca and I work, we used to have patient navigators outside of clinical trials, and due to funding reasons, we no longer do. Within clinical trials, we still have research assistants who are excellent navigators, but they only step in once a patient is on a clinical trial. It's that one step earlier, getting patients to a clinical trial, that the navigation piece could come in, and that could be a quick win, because individual hospitals could implement that, immediately if they're motivated. And how can we implement that? Well, maybe when a patient is being registered as a new patient at a cancer center, can they be consented at that time for contact related to research? And then if they are agreeable to that, which I think the majority would be, then a research assistant may be able to contact them even before their initial physician contact to give them some information about possible trials, or at least let them know that this is a center that does clinical trials. Ask your doctor about it. And that's just one easy way we could help patients advocate further for themselves with that knowledge through a simple navigation tool up front.
Thanks, Anne. My name is Vacha Vartaken. I'm the owner of a CRO in Canada, and we do mostly industry-sponsored trials. I have actually a comment and a question. So my comment with regards to access for patients to clinical trials, one thing that we need to think about as well is, especially for northern communities in each province and territory, access is nil right now, especially the indigenous communities, where they don't even have access to the internet, for example. So when we talk about decentralized trials and virtual care, that's a huge problem. Some of these patients need to travel 6, 7, 8 hours to major city centers, Saskatoon, Regina, those type of centers in Ontario as well, in the northern parts. So something as simple as giving internet access to these communities could help a lot. So that's just one comment I have. But in terms of engagement, I would like to, also it's kind of a segue to what you had mentioned, I would like to mention engagement of investigators or healthcare practitioners. How can we do that better? Because one thing we've seen in the last 5, 6, 7 years is the lack of interest, I would say, of healthcare practitioners to become principal investigators or even sub-investigators in clinical trials. Mostly what we hear from our side is due to the resourcing issues. It's just burdensome for them to do a trial. We see a lot of investigators, basically we call them the one and done investigators. So they do one trial, they say, wow, this was a crazy effort and I don't want to do one again, although they still care about their patients and they want to provide that care. So just a question to all of you, do you have any ideas on how to engage those type of healthcare practitioners in your hospitals or clinics, community centers, and what can we do to basically increase that interest?
Okay, yeah, I can start off with that. So it's an excellent point. I was actually just at a conference a few days ago talking about burnout among physicians, talking about the proportion of physicians wanting to reduce their hours, reduce their FTE, and at that same conference we were also talking about advocacy for patients and advocacy for physicians. And I asked the question there, and I'll say it again, how are we reconciling the burnout among physicians, the huge demands that they have, with also their desire, obligation, responsibility to advocate for themselves, for patients, and specifically run clinical trials? And it's an incredibly difficult question. At the end of the day, I think a lot of the regulation around clinical trials, even at the hospital level, I've been sub-PI for clinical trials in my own hospital. It's a lot of regulation, it is a lot of work. As Rebecca mentioned, it's not something we're really trained to do in our medical system, in our residencies, and then we take on our faculty position and all of a sudden someone says, here's your trial, go run it. So I think it does need to start at the beginning. As mentioned many times, I think we've all said it different ways, research is care, it's how we get our patients the best treatments. And I think starting at the beginning in medical school, in residency, letting learners be involved and take some leadership, take some control early on will make it, first of all, less intimidating. And I think, as I mentioned a few times, I do think there's a lot of red tape, a lot of regulation, a lot of rules that are not giving us the benefit we think we're getting on the safety side, and we're shooting ourselves in the foot from an access perspective, also lending itself to the fact that physicians may be less inclined to take on such a task with so many roadblocks and red tape in front of them. And if we can really re-examine that whole regulatory process at the higher levels down to the hospital level, I think we can motivate many more physicians to take on that role.
Please.
Yeah, I would just, I think you're right. I think, I wanted to just, because I did use some very deliberate but provocative words, and when I spoke, I said patients have a right to participate in research, and we have a responsibility. I think if we actually lived those words, if we believed them and lived them, then the system could change in a way that it wouldn't be so burdensome, I don't think, and it would enable this integration of research and care. So if physicians believed that research was not a separate thing, but something that they did as part of their job, because it's their responsibility, because that is the best care for patients, then that changes the framework. I mean, physicians are under pressure, research are not right now, so I'm not sure we can fix that, but that's part of it. If, for example, I toured the clinical trials unit at the chemo unit yesterday, and there's 2 research nurses sitting there and nobody in the clinical trials beds because they don't have anyone today. But their salaries are fully paid and they're sitting there. They're waiting for patients to come in to do a trial that has some blood draws for PK. Their full salaries being paid to draw the blood. I said, why can't they just be in a regular bed and why can't the nurses draw the blood? Well, they're not trained on the protocol. Well, that doesn't make sense. So now we're paying 2 people to sit there all day for no reason when there are other nurses available. And so if nurses were, if a hospital was accredited to do clinical trials, would Health Canada have to audit every single trial? Or would they audit a hospital to be able to do clinical trials? So I just think a completely different way of thinking, right? If, that's not a research nurse, but that's a nurse who is trained also to do research because that's part of your job. And so it's part of the job of the pharmacist and the phlebotomist too. And every single person, including the guy who opens the door at the front of the hospital, understands that research is part of their job. Then some of these burdens actually just disappear. So I think if we use the word right, if we said that research was a medically necessary service in the Canada Health Act, and the word responsibility, you're a hospital, you have a responsibility to deliver research. If we use those 2 words, then things actually do get a little bit easier.
Stephen, you have the last question.
Oh, thank you. Steve Zuckerman with 3CTN, most of the panel. So thanks again. A really rich conversation and so many topics to touch on. But in the interest of time, and I'll limit my question, comment, but I'd like your thoughts on this. I think what I heard from some of the questions and the opportunities that were presented, I can invest or inject some perspective as the ED of 3CTN, a network of 61 trial centers, and patient partner, community practice, and other stakeholders in the industry. What we see and what we hear from our membership is, as far as what we can do now, there are, to the questions or requests for innovation in the space, there are initiatives around trial funding and also patient navigation, maybe different than at the institutional level, but now helping patients find trials and those that require that support. So, the Trial Navigator program out of the University of Windsor that's been funded by 3CTN, in Quebec, Quebec and Oncologist, which is that, thank you. Yes, in Canada, yeah, we've got the stakeholders here. The ACT Consortium has partnered with a public awareness campaign via the Cure. So there is that opportunity, as I see it, for stitching together awareness of trials and positive messaging of trials to trial navigation and trial finding. That also includes precision medicine. There's innovations out of University of Toronto, UHM, on the PMATCH initiative that we're involved in, that's going to take precision medicine trials and help patients and clinicians find those difficult to match trials. And other initiatives that exist and create a continuum of continuity of support for patients that's grounded in constructive and helpful and knowledge and awareness and knowledge of trials. Do you see any opportunity for us to bring those parties together and create really that holistic support process? Because I know Canada doesn't have one recognized trusted source for trial finding. But there's an opportunity for those, they're all good and they all provide a service, but I think for us to put together a comprehensive approach to helping patients, looking at it from a patient's perspective. I can go and try to find a trial, and my results are going to be different than someone else who goes to find a trial. So I'd like to hear your comments on that. Do you think there's room for that, or how we can move forward with that?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. So what you described sounds a little bit like the C3 initiative, and maybe I'll let Rebecca talk a bit more about that, because I know you're intimately involved if you would like, but a way to bring together all the resources, absolutely. Although, as a physician myself, always looking for trials for my patients, half of those organizations and things you just mentioned I'm not familiar with as a physician. How can we expect our patients to be familiar with them? And, that, I think the idea is fantastic. How do we bring it all together? That's a question, I think, for regulators and for someone to really think through and have one point of contact for physicians or patients, because having patients be able to take the initiative, and many want to and will if they have the opportunity and the knowledge, one point of contact that then, filters into all the different areas that you just described. I think that's a fantastic idea, and I think that's what we're missing.
I totally agree. I think that right now it's very inefficient that we have lots of different organizations doing very similar things, and it doesn't kind of lend itself well to sustainability in that sense as well. But I think what you're describing is really what's actually been planned for Australia, and having the national clinical trials front door that is supposedly the kind of the entry point to clinical trials and information from all different stakeholders. So I think there's a number of other jurisdictions thinking about this as well.
And I think, so the C3 initiative, which Joanna talked about, is for cholangiocarcinoma. It was funded through a generous grant through the Canadian Cancer Society Breakthrough Grant for this rare cancer. And we have patients can reach out to a research navigator across the country, and that research navigator can help them get access to molecular testing, to multidisciplinary rounds, to clinical trial matching, which we partnered with the program in Windsor as well, the 3CTN program. Our biggest problem is that there are no trials in Canada, or there's a trial at Princess Margaret, but you live in Nova Scotia and you can't access it because you can't cross provincial borders for research because research is not considered care. So those are the frustrations and barriers, and of course that's a small, it's a rare disease, so it's doable with a single individual. It wouldn't be doable for larger cancers, but I think it's more of a data problem, because if we had really good, all the time, real-time data of what trials are open, where they're at in terms of activation, where they're at in terms of enrollment, which is not true of clinical trials Gotfrit, it's very out of date. But if we had that data system, which I think 3CTN has talked about that, right? Like a real-time data system, then creating a bot, an AI bot, who could say, hi, I'm, Mario, I can help you find a clinical trial. And put your data in there, or it pulls it from your electronic medical record in some way. I mean, this is very doable. I feel like it's more of a data problem, and I completely agree with Stuart. We got to work together on this. It absolutely will not work if everyone tries to do it separately.
Yeah, I think, thank you very much. I would add to what you said, Rebecca, that I think in terms of having a nice problem to solve would be a demand for clinical trials that we struggle to meet. Right, more interest than we have from patients in terms of recruitment and potential patients on trial than we have trials themselves. I think that would solve itself pretty quickly. But well said. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to end this panel there. I can't think of a better way to set up the workshop that is going to happen this afternoon. We spent, and I think many people in this room would agree, that there's solutions have been well articulated in many, many ways for many, many years. It's the how, it's the will, it's the collaboration that this conference particularly brings together and will be the focus of the workshop today. So to Joanna, to Stuart, to Rebecca, thank you so much. I hope you get a chance to interact and work with some of the folks who didn't get a chance to ask questions today. Rebecca, Stuart, and Joanna are with us for the workshop as well. Thank you.